as well as those watching on WHAASCO.com, neighbors and friends, and on the West Hartford Political Forum. We're going to get rolling here when Ronni gives me the word.
It's going to follow through.
Okay, so we're good? Am I good to start, Ronni?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. All right, welcome to this week's WHAASCO.com Roundtable. I'm John Lyons, and with me as always is Ronni Newton, the managing editor of WHAASCO.com.
Hello?
Are you not hearing me?
I hear you.
Okay, I heard a hello. So tomorrow is June 19th. It's known as Juneteenth, and it marks one of the most important dates in the history of the USA. On this day, General Order Number 3 was read, freeing Texas slaves and beginning the end of the Civil War and bringing freedom to Black Americans across the South. Today, as the worldwide discussion on racism gains momentum, we are going to look at the roots of race in America and endemic racism. From the beginning of the slave trade in 1619 up until present day, why is the U.S. continuing to struggle with deep-seated racism, and what needs to be done once and for all to end racism in America? Today, we have two distinguished guests on our show. Earl Exum is a West Hartford resident and president of West Hartford African American Social and Cultural Organization, known as WHAASCO. He is on the executive committee for the Urban League of Greater Hartford. He is the executive champion for the African American Forum Employee Resource Group at his corporation, and he's a member of the Executive Leadership Council, a professional organization dedicated to the development and advancement of African American and Black senior executives. He is a member of the Alpha Phi Alpha and Sigma Pi Phi fraternal organizations focused on African American and Black college graduates and accomplished professionals, respectively. He is currently on the board of advisors for supply chain management program at the Howard University Business School. He is Vice Moderator-elect and on the executive committee of the Asylum Hill Congregational Church. He is also former president of the board of directors for WHCI TV in West Hartford, Connecticut, where we are being broadcast live. Dr. Kazu Kangwana is a West Hartford resident and is a psychotherapist specialized in the treatment of trauma. She is also a certified practitioner in rapid resolution therapy, a method that integrates the emotional and rational systems of the brain to rapidly and effectively heal emotional pain. When she's not working with clients, Kazo gives presentations on authentic relationships, parenting, and the relationship between mental health and spirituality. Kazo also has a passion for supporting women and parents through coaching and writing about parenting and personal growth. Kazo has lived on 4 continents, born in Kenya and living in the USA for 17 years, the last 11 right here in West Hartford. We are grateful to have both of you here tonight. And Earl, let me start with you. My introduction, they were prepared remarks, I think, as I told you, and I refer to the year 1619. Talk to us a little bit about why the year 1619 is so significant and what happened, and then just kind of walk us forward.
Okay. So in the year 1619, that's the first real presence of people of African descent in the U.S. that were brought here specifically for indentured servitude, which ultimately in this country became slavery. It was a result of a ship that had gone to South America. It was on its way back to Europe, came back to the U.S. and decided to get some provisions in the U.S. And what they traded was effectively 20 people of African descent. It's fascinating stories about those people because of indentured servitude, several of them, if not all of them, eventually became free because they actually did their servitude and then became free. And several of them were very, very productive citizens in the U.S. Since then, though, because of economic reasons, the agricultural economy really needed labor. The economy blew up, cotton, other things that sugar in South America, but cotton really in the U.S. Became such a commodity. The demand for the labor just became so much that it became advantageous to just keep people in servitude forever. They were able to do it more easily with people of African descent because they were discernible from other people. So it's much harder to keep white people in servitude forever, because things like escaping was much easier because you could integrate into the community and you couldn't discern the slaves, people who are enslaved from people who are not. So that's where it all began. That's where the first Africans were brought over on a ship and brought to the United States, and the legacy continues.
And again, staying in that time period, very often these people, probably most of the time, were taken against their will. They were kidnapped, stolen, or purchased by these traders.
Yes.
I mean, that's just a horrible thought.
So, Earl, I have to just interject something. This isn't really in our history books.
No.
And so, you know, I mean, I took AP US history when I was in high school, and I don't remember ever learning this. Where is the disconnect, and why? And is that part of the conversation that we need to start having?
Yeah, well, you know my passions well by asking that question. So when you really, and I'll say something slightly provocative here. It's about as provocative as I get because I like to stick with the facts. But I would say that the history that we're taught is a white supremacist history. Compulsory education in the U.S. began in about 1850s, let's say. Don't quote me on the exact date, roughly then, through roughly the 1920s. States began to make education compulsory. But think about what was going on at the time. I mean, we had just extreme discrimination. It was very, very difficult for African American people at that point. And of course, while they were building a curriculum, anyone in their right mind, if they're going to fund it from the government standpoint, is going to want people who are committed to the government and all of the systems that are in place. As a result, we either gloss over or basically embellish the history. So 1619 was left out. Lots of misconceptions, some of which I still hear are taught in schools today about why Black people have the circumstances they have, why they had them in the past. It's something that really does need to be addressed, because when you really start teaching Black history and African American history, it's amazing. When I went to college and really was enlightened on things that never were taught to me. If you know the term gaslighting, I use it a lot. Gaslighting is basically making someone feel like they're crazy. Like, for example, it was used a lot in the Me Too movement, where a woman who was raped or assaulted was somehow made to feel like it was their fault. That's gaslighting. When I got my education in college about Black history, I felt gaslighted. I felt like, why would someone have not taught me these things before? And quite frankly, I've said it before many times, the history we teach makes Black people feel bad, and it makes white people feel better. And we perpetuate it over and over, and it contributes a lot to the systems that we have in place today.
I mean, just there's so much. There's so much to talk about on that topic. You know, okay, so you talked about when compulsory education began, late 1800s, early 1900s. But going back to your initial comment, 1619 and that era, Black people were used for indentured servitude because it was harder for them to escape. Did I understand that right?
No, I was making the distinction between indentured servitude and slavery. Now, enslaving people. The difference between the enslavement is that basically a new precedent was started that you could be enslaved for the rest of your life based at that time on the race of your mother, right? So if you were white and your mother was white, right? Because, and we can talk about race. Race is a construct, right? If you check everyone's DNA, everyone's traces back to Africa. So at what point do you discern that one person is white and one person is Black? I always ask the question, how many great grandparents do you have to have that are white before you're white, right? If you have one Black grandparent, are you Black or white? If you have two Black great grandparents, are you Black or white? You have to just make something up, because all of DNA effectively goes back to Africa. But basically they had a rule now, which changed over time based on different states and different laws, but generalizing, you will be enslaved from your birth, not that you were brought and sold and that you were given a contract for time. From your birth till your death, strictly based on the color of your skin.
Yeah, and and that went on for hundreds or 150 years,
Yep.
longer.
Yep.
So, Kadzo, I'm sorry, we're kind of focus on, what are your thoughts? What's your understanding? What do you have to say on this?
Thanks, John. Thanks, Earl, for just getting us right to the heart of the matter. And one of the things that I want to say now, as we are just coming through, not sure about what lies ahead with this COVID epidemic, is that there's a phenomenon going on now that really harkens or is similar to what went on then, right? Because we are looking to science, and the scientists to give us a sense of what we can expect, how we need to behave, how to stay safe, right? So we're all sort of glued for a period of time on our TVs, whatever media we use, as to the direction of how to think about this, right? And the reason I bring that up now is because the pseudoscience, we know it now as pseudoscience, but at the time, right, to justify this really oppressive practice, politicians, regular people looked to science to provide some proof that would justify the treating of other people like that, of people of dark skin. And an idea that's really important to think about with this is the idea of cognitive dissonance, right? So in our history, our Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. And yet the people that were writing it actually themselves were slave owners. And so in order to justify themselves or to reconcile this disconnect in their minds, this cognitive dissonance, which is actually a very uncomfortable feeling because you're acting one way and thinking another, and it's a very uncomfortable space for a human to exist, need to tell themselves some kind of story that would justify these oppressive practices. And so one of the things that you find through this time from the early 1600s, but mostly the 1800s in American history, is sort of a systematic consolidating of otherizing people with black skin, right? So I think I'm not the most familiar with history, so please look up everything I say, but Thomas Jefferson himself, sort of starts to say and give a flavor of, maybe, and they use the term Negro at that time, these Negroes are less than white, in the different publications of that time. And so he sort of sets the stage to invite the scientists of that time to actually use data to justify that, right? And so suddenly you have physicians, scientists, university professors looking at how is it that people with dark skin are inferior. So that is the lens through which they look. And so over time, there's this consolidating of, okay, we can actually treat these people however we want, and we can actually be cruel to them because they're less than human, right? And so we find ourselves now in a framework of thinking, both at the conscious level and at the subconscious level, that has been systematically informed with this discourse of inferiority, right? And so even when at some point slaves were freed and the legal structures that separate people are no longer in place, this thinking that has seeped into the subconscious of society is still there. And that's the struggle that we are now facing. And, I'm glad we're having conversations like this because we need to look forward as to what is possible for us,
Kadzo, I really appreciate your comments. And one of the things a mistake I'm so fearful of making tonight, two mistakes. Number one, moving too quickly in terms of the timeline. I don't feel that shows proper respect to how this all happened, I'll dive into that in a minute. And then number two, I don't want to turn this into a taught U.S. history lesson, because as Earl alluded to, this is horrifying. I wasn't taught so much of this in college or in high school or in grammar school. It just wasn't taught. It was, they perfumed the pig. I hope I'm okay using that term, where, oh, this is bad, we're just not going to teach it. This doesn't reflect well on whomever. And I can't help but think about that. There's so many thoughts that come to mind. Number one, that people were actually able to be convinced to follow this path and somehow buy into this incredibly terrible treatment of human beings. And all I can come to, and here I go falling into trap number two, going to history, is Nazi Germany, where these Germans, they stood and saluted to a person that was so evil and so corrupt that it's just unimaginable. I think today, how could so many people follow such a terrible path? I don't know if that's a question or not, but if you'd like to comment, either of you.
Let me make this one comment there's a saying that if the Lyons were the writers of history.
Oh my God, I love this quote.
Right? And
go ahead.
You say something that it provokes a thought that I've had many times. We all think Hitler was a horrible person. If Germany had won the war, our history would show, or the world's history would show, he was the greatest leader ever.
Yep.
Right?
Can you say that quote again, Earl? Because John, when we were talking about this show, that was the exact quote I was trying to come up with. If the Lyons were the writers of history,
then the hunters would not be the heroes, right? And that's what happens is so many people, this entire country, just keep this in mind. I assure you, and I can show you the data to prove this or to support this. If not for slavery, the United States probably would not be the predominant power in the world today, right? Between slavery, which built a foundation of wealth in this country that then proceeded on to the Industrial Revolution, that's when we turned the corner, is when this economy just exploded. And it was unbelievable, the wealth that was created in this country on the back of slavery. The reason why people had to solve for this cognitive dissonance is because they didn't want to give up that wealth, right? There were plenty of abolitionists. There were plenty of examples. Black people going to Harvard while other black people were enslaved, but yet say, well, black people aren't smart enough to control their own free will and destiny. The reason why people were able to justify that and educate each other in this way was because they needed to justify it, because so much wealth was built upon slavery. It had to be justified. And if it was wrong, there was so much that wealthy people would have had to give up in order to accept that it was wrong.
Kenzo?
I recently learned that actually Hitler's model for the conquest of Europe was based on what he admired of the conquest of the Americas. So he was, having watched how America sort of moved people, did all that they needed to do, was wanting to do the same. So just a little tidbit of information there.
So moving forward to the end of the Civil War, and again, I don't think it's showing you proper respect to turn this into a history lesson. I think it goes way beyond that. But my sense is the Civil War ended. It's like, okay, you're free, and I'm doing this now, and somehow the former slave owners felt they were absolved of all wrong. The war is over. Okay, go on your own. But there was no structure. There was no reparations. And I understand reparations are a big discussion today, which I support. What happened? What should have happened? Talk to us about that.
Tetsu, would you like to go first? Because I could jump all over this question.
like I said, that there was this brainwashing, right, of everybody, the general public, by the scientists of the time, the physician of the time, in terms of the ordering of life, right? This was also a period, sort of, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, a time when people were exploring ideas in science, and they were thinking about, how different species fit together. There's a lot of publications that were kind of implying that people of dark skin were inferior. That became the way that people think. That is the struggle that we have to solve right now in America. Because you can take away the structures, as I said. You can say, okay, everybody's free. But it's that way of thinking that people of dark skin are inferior, somehow white people are superior, that we need to get at. And, from that perspective, I really think this racism that we're struggling with, this anti-Blackness that we're struggling with, is a symptom of a disease. And that disease is actually our forgetting the oneness of mankind. So we've been through a machinery that has been, in terms of the thoughts, the books that have been written, all of the messages telling us how we're different, how some people are inferior. And we have to unlearn that piece, right? Because we are brothers and sisters. And in that moment when you have an officer kneeling on somebody's neck, right? That's what he's forgotten, and that's what we have to reclaim. He forgets that this is my brother, right? And when in the forgetting of that connection with one another, not only does he do a disservice to the person who's under him, but he's done a huge disservice to himself as a human being, right? So we are in the process now of having to reclaim our identity as brothers and sisters. I just listened to a podcast with Austin Channing Brown, where she says the work of anti-racism is really humans learning to treat other humans as humans, right? Which I think is a wonderful way of putting that we need to start relating to one another, not from sort of different, but actually one and the same. It's so we're not looking to a future where we're different, coexisting in our own spaces and separate, but really seeking the highest level of expression of our human existence, which is that, you, John, are my brother, you, Ronni, are my sister, and that when we can relate to one another there, then we start to move in the right direction. Earl, over to you.
I want to, there's so much in your question, John. And first I want to tell you, if this became a history lesson, I'm okay, because the only thing I read is nonfiction and I love history.
Okay.
But let's talk about what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation and the freeing of the slaves. First, I highly recommend a book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. The title of
I'm taking notes.
Was about modern racism. When you read that book, you will see the systems that are in place that will make you understand why. Because some people say, well, hey, if, why aren't Black people doing better? Why aren't they more CEOs? And why is the wealth gap there? And why is the education gap there? Trust me, the systems are very, very clear, and in some cases very deliberate, that caused this. But let's talk about, in this book, it's called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. It talks about post-slavery. And we learn in school, oh, the slaves were freed. Great. Abraham Lincoln was great. And Abraham Lincoln was great. But there's a big history to how Abraham Lincoln got there. And oh, by the way, there were a bunch of Black people in his life, African Americans, that taught him along the way to arrive at the way that he thought. He did not think that way when he first entered politics. He thought the best solution was to take all the African people of descent and put them on a boat and send them back to Africa. It was people like Frederick Douglass who said, no, we were born here. We built this country. This is our country. You can't just, we don't even speak the language from where you want to send us. But what happened was, during the Emancipation Proclamation and the freedom of the slaves, and remember, the Emancipation Proclamation was a war strategy. If the South had conceded and surrendered at the point at which the Emancipation Proclamation was released, they would have been allowed to keep slavery. It was only because they didn't. It was a tactic to say, I don't think Lincoln thought it would work, but he said, if you surrender, you can keep slaves. They didn't. So thus slaves became free, which of course didn't happen until the war actually ended and there was some level of enforcement. But again, the whole economy was dependent on slavery. So what did they do? They made laws that said, if you get arrested, we're allowed to now put you into servitude again. And and they made vagrancy laws, which said, if you didn't have a place to live, you were a vagrant. Well, by definition, if you were previously a slave and you were living on the slave owner's land and the slave owner freed you, but you had nowhere to go, you were a vagrant, which then allowed them to arrest you and put you into servitude again. Here's the thing. Some would argue that circumstance was worse than slavery because as a slave, the person or an enslaved person, you're an asset that has value. If you no longer are owned, you're not an asset that has value. If you were to die working, they could simply, theoretically, arrest someone else and bring that person in. The circumstance was terrible. And again, back to your point, that's not what they teach you in school. That was supposed to be the point at which it should have all gotten better. There are many who will argue it got much worse for some period of time after slavery.
Ronni, do you have any questions? Because I can keep going here.
Well, I kind of have a big question, and maybe it's too soon to go here, but I kind of feel like we're at a watershed moment right now, and that the movement that's been started that was really precipitated the most by George Floyd's murder is different. I mean, I feel like the conversations that are taking place now are different from even 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. What's different about it, and how is this conversation just being reframed? And it really seems like people are listening and are trying much harder to listen and really understand how we got to this point and how we can get to the next point. What are your thoughts about that? Or is it too soon in this conversation to even ask that question?
No, it's a good question. Kadzu, you want to go first?
You go ahead.
Okay. So what's different? First of all, this was a cumulative effect. There's a number of things that happened. First of all, the book I just quoted you, The New Jim Crow, that book is taught at CCSU in a freshman seminar. There are a lot of young people that have been exposed to new data that wasn't there before. A lot of colleges over several years have started to incorporate African-American history into their curriculum and are teaching things about systematic racism. There are people like Brian Stevenson, if you've heard of him, the Equal Justice Project. He was the attorney, if you heard of the movie Just Mercy that was just done. He's the attorney that represents people who are forcibly put in jail. Let me just give you a statistic just real quick. 1 out of 9 people that he represents, he gets out of jail, meaning they were falsely convicted. The hurdle to get someone out of jail who has been through our criminal justice system prosecuted and convicted is extremely high. If he can get 1 out of 9 people out, I must presume that there's a lot more innocent people in jail who just couldn't meet the legal technical hurdles. So you got Brian Stevenson with the Equal Justice Project, who's he did the lynching museum down in Alabama. So he's exposing a lot of this. You have people getting educated. You have got people like Colin Kaepernick, who are taking very public stands to focus people's attention on police brutality, which if you're Black in America, this is not a revelation to you that there's police brutality. But now that we have cell phones and we have awareness, some of which Colin Kaepernick and others created, then you have this cumulative effect of things just that are egregious to more egregious to unbelievably egregious. You know, remember, right before George Floyd, a man was jogging. 2 people in a pickup truck chased that person down, cornered him because he tried to get away, pointed a gun at him, and then said it was in their own self-defense that they shot him. Could you imagine what would happen to Earl Exum if I chased somebody jogging down in West Hartford, pointed a gun at him, and then claimed it was self-defense? It was just so egregious. It goes on. Eric Gardner, Trayvon Martin, the lady who was for smoking a cigarette, who's dragged out of a car, put in a cell. And people don't realize this. Sandra Bland. They say she hung herself, right? There was 3 hours of videotape outside of that cell that went missing. So it's the cumulative effect with a level of education and awareness that we haven't had before that I think, and I will tell you, Ronni, I am actually amazed, because I would have thought that it would have been when Trayvon Martin's case was, or Eric Gardner. I don't know exactly what this one is. Maybe it's because it's COVID. We can't watch basketball. We can't watch sports. The news cycle just seems the same. We've got time to talk to people. Maybe that's that converged all this. But you know, I'm very happy that we're having to have the conversation. I tell a lot of people that I love and respect that the circumstances are horrible, but how pleased I am that we can have this conversation now. You guys wouldn't have done this show previously. This would have been too uncomfortable of a conversation.
Well, and you're right, and sadly you're right, and you know, I admit that you're right. It just wouldn't have been in our consciousness, not because we necessarily thought differently, but because it just wouldn't have occurred to us to the extent it does now, that it's so necessary to have this conversation.
Earl, let me ask you this. Is that, you know, you have a really good grasp on the history here. Is there a time between, I'm trying to find a time. I can't find one. I don't know enough. But, you know, between the end of the Civil War and today, where maybe things started to improve, and then, I feel like they've slipped backwards, and I'm not trying to make this a political discussion at all, but I feel like it slipped backwards. Am I wrong? Am I right? Is there a time when you feel like, hey, we're making progress here?
I don't know the answer. I will tell you that the history that I observe for people of African descent in America is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Which is progress, because it's net 1 step. But, you know, I firmly believe the reaction you get to a Barack Obama in this country is a Donald Trump. I think there's a point at which the fact of the matter is, many of us, particularly in a place like West Hartford, where a disproportionate amount of people are educated, don't come in contact with a blatant racist who's going to tell you, I hate a person simply because of the color of their skin. But I will tell you, it's built into our systems and consciousness, and back to the cognitive dissonance that was discussed earlier. It is in our consciousness that white people are better than black people. And I'm going to tell you that you have to believe that to accept the way things are today. Disproportionately, we only have 4 black CEOs in this country. If you just look at the number of African-American people who enter corporate America, why could you get your mind around that it's so disproportionately low? We've only had 1 African-American woman CEO of a Fortune 500 company in history. African-American women get degrees at almost twice the rate of African-American males. So, of course, it's the double thing. It's the women thing and the black thing that causes that. But somehow, if you accept that, right, or at least, just to say accept it, you must believe that somehow they don't deserve it, right? Mm-hmm. Or you don't think about it enough, or don't care about it enough to even think about it. But it's in our consciousness. And as a result, again, you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and people can be easily not look at data, right? Oh, we have Tiger Woods, we have Serena Williams. Those are 2 good examples of how it just blows away the conventions of thought from years ago. But that's my answer. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That is the history, which is progress, by the way. I mean, you know, black people are getting college degrees at a rate that like never before, despite the hurdles that they face with, you know, you guys know the story about the education gap. If you're in Hartford, you know, I've heard it said many, many times, an A in Hartford is a C in West Hartford. So if I got to show up to UConn and I've been getting A's for work that somebody in West Hartford is getting a C for, I got a heck of a road to graduate from UConn. But nevertheless, Black people are graduating at a pretty good rate, certainly relative to what it was before.
So, I mean, you say 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. I mean, this is just not good enough. And, you know, again, trying to stay away from the politics, but I think the last 3 years have been very divisive. And I don't like seeing divisiveness being encouraged in general, whether we're talking about political divisiveness. And there's, you know, I get 100 emails a day from various political organizations, and the vast majority of them very negative and attacking somebody. And even just at a baseline, with that considered an acceptable part of our culture, I'm sorry, again, I'm not asking a question, I'm making a statement, but I just think I feel challenged, and this is why Ronni and I are doing this, and I think, you know, Ronni and I agree on this, since we feel challenged to not just say it's wrong, but to actively do something, which is why we're doing these series. Mm-hmm. But it's not enough. You know, what, you know, there we go. I broke rule number 1 now. I'm fast forwarding because it's just too easy to do. What the heck do we do? You know, how do we solve these problems?
You know, we're talking about the way people define themselves, how they think about who they are, what they're here to do, right? And that's really the purview of the spiritual domain, right? So the problem that we're looking at in terms of anti-Blackness, racism, is a spiritual problem. And so the solution then would also be one that would be informed by spirit, because it would be a redefining what it means to be human in a way. You know, and Ronni, to speak to your comment that this seems a little different, people are sort of a little more awake. I think we are moving forward as a human society in terms of awakening to a consciousness that is larger than perhaps we had before, you know. And most people that I talk to, I haven't lived here all my life, but everyone is commenting in terms of the protests that we had. Even our local one in West Hartford, you know, was multiracial in terms of the people that showed up to say, we're done with this, right? Apparently this is a new face of protest. It hasn't been the case even 5 years ago. And so I think we're emerging into a consciousness that, you know, the oppression of one is the oppression of all. And the hurting of one is the hurting of all, you know. And something I think that's sort of locally very, very pertinent, you know, most people I meet in West Hartford in my life, my work life, and life of the school of life of the schools of my children, would not consider themselves racist. They would consider themselves very fair, and they would, you know, some of them would say, I'm not racist, you're my friend, right? And I think one of the things that we need to pay attention to and maybe have conversations with our children is that the very foundations of where we find ourselves in West Hartford as a community is not just. So speaking to what Earl is saying in terms of the structure and the system, you know, we moved here and a few months into living here, I had to sort of sit with my kids around the kitchen counter and say, okay, so, and we selected to come to West Hartford from overseas on the internet looking for good schools, right? And so we come, we love the schools that the kids have been in. They've been really very well prepared for where they are now. And then you realize that there's a really dark underbelly to that reality, right? And that it comes from discriminatory federal government policies of the 1930s that meant that, and if you look at a map that shows, you know, sort of housing and redlining in Connecticut, you know, West Hartford is very much sort of a green-blue area. But this phenomenon where the federal government set up the agency, the Federal Housing Administration Agency, and that changed, you know, but in the 1930s, I think if you were to look at how many Americans own their homes, it would have been about 30%, you know, and then if you look much later on in time, it goes up to 70%. And that really happened as a result of these loans that the government had said that they would guarantee, and banks were able to give those loans. But those loans were not available equally to everybody. They were really only available to white people. And so, and the, you know, the structure of how people were able to buy the homes that they had also became different, because you were able to then put 10% down, 20% down, and the bank would guarantee the other 80%, which is pretty much the structure that we bought our homes now, and people do that who can. And so that, in a way, if you meet most Americans and they have any kind of wealth, it's in their real estate. But that was an opportunity that was given unfairly to people to accumulate wealth and to start to be able to pass that wealth on to their families, that wasn't available to everybody. So a house of very similar size, say that's in Hartford, which is a desirable area, an undesirable area, to a house same size in West Hartford are of very different value right now. And that we called it redlining, where literally lines were drawn in terms of where loans would be guaranteed and where people would be supported to buy houses in unfavorable areas. And there were 4 categories. And the highest category was really neighborhoods that had very few, if any, people who were minorities. So that was a structure in our policy. And then the next category was, less desirable. And then certainly the next one would be people would be moving in, moving out. And the last one, which was the red category, was where there were primarily minorities, right? So right there, for anybody that lives in this town right now, is a structure of determining the value of your property, determining the wealth of your family, what's possible for your children, that is based on a very unjust structure, right? And I think it's important for us to be having conversations with our children in terms of, hey, we find ourselves here, we want to come into good schools, but this wasn't a fair playing field. It wasn't a level playing field, right? And why is it important that we know that, right? Because when I say, to anyone, I want to have a conversation of, I've had to, deal with race in this way or that, rather than going to, a personal defense or like, oh, I'm not racist, to just be aware that the structures that we live in were essentially that. So not only are we looking at informing ourselves as individuals, but also understanding compassionately that not everybody had the same opportunities. And then that changes the way we look at the world, I mean, we've got kids going to school probably thinking, oh, my dad did really well and he worked really hard and he's made it. What's wrong with you, right? How come you guys aren't making it? But really knowing that, yes, there is this dark side to where we find ourselves might mean that we are more compassionate with one another and more open to each other's experiences.
I think of the term white privilege, which I've seen a lot of denial, on Facebook, social media, things like that, where somebody will say something, I grew up poor, I know I'm white, but I didn't, and they just, to me, it just seems like, certainly based on what you just said, Kenza, they just don't get it, just by virtue of being white, regardless of anything else in their circumstance.
We have an editorial that's on WHAA right now, by a white man who said, I need to come to terms with the denial. I mean, come to terms with understanding and then deny, or I'm not going to get it right, but he needs to come to terms with the fact that white privilege exists and he can't deny it any longer. Yeah. And it's actually sparked quite a discussion that I've watched to make sure it hasn't gotten appropriate. It's kind of been on the bounds of being inappropriate, but I don't want to cut off that conversation. So I tend to let the comments proliferate on our Facebook page, as long as people don't start personally attacking each other.
Allow me to speak on white privilege for a second, just to try to make it resonate, because I've heard the same thing you said, John. Until recently, people said, Privilege is people whose parents pay 100% of their education to go to Ivy League school, maybe even pay somebody to pretend they're an athlete so that they can get into a school. That's privilege, right?
Yeah.
But let's share some data. And I apologize, I can't quote the source, but this is easy to find. A simple Google search will arrive at. But are you guys familiar with the resume study?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Resumes. This is just data, right? And they put the exact same credentials, same school, same address, same phone number. Every single thing was the same, except for the name. In some cases, the name would be Cheryl. The other one would be Shamika, or Daryl and Darrell. They sent those into companies to see who would get called back for the interviews. An alarmingly high difference occurred. I think it's 30%, but don't quote me on 30%. Alarmingly high difference between who got called back. In some cases, by the same company, just based on the name of the resume and the presumption that the name was of African American person's name. That would be an example of white privilege. You get called for the interview because they presume that you're white. Versus the company. That means that you, and there's tons of examples of this, and McKinsey has great data, McKinsey Consulting has great data on this, that suggests you are given an unfair advantage. And that's just one example. It is throughout, it's from the time that you're in the hospital as a baby, the medical care you get versus the medical care that the Black baby gets, right? There's tons of studies on why do Black people die with the same health insurance, the same medical care. You know, how do you deduce that they're dying when other people aren't? So it's statistical. It's not like this concept. It's not like there's some people out there. There's data that simply suggests that from early in life, there's a disadvantage for people of African descent and an advantage for people of white descent.
And that's what, going back to a comment I made earlier, what I just find so overwhelming about this, it is so systemic. I mean, everywhere you look, there's data and examples that can't be reasonably disputed that this is happening. Where do you start?
Yeah, I've said this many times because I want something to be actionable, right? My biggest fear is we do a whole lot of protesting and nothing changes, right? Mm-hmm. We all feel better about ourselves temporarily. So what can people do that are simple, right? Number one is educate yourself. My wife says something sometimes that I found very impactful. Once you see something, you can't unsee it. Once you know something, you can't unknow it. I believe that people are good people, right? Certainly in West Hartford, I encounter good people way more than I encounter bad people. If they knew, right? If they solved for this cognitive dissonance, they would not arrive at conclusions that Black people just can't play hockey, right? The next Tiger Woods of hockey is coming soon, right? Or that white people can't play running back, right? These are just things that people, because of what you see, your mind. There's a book called Dance with Chance. It's by a statistician. Now, my other love, other than history, is statistics. And once you look at statistics, right, it solves for things where people draw conclusions that when you look at the statistics simply don't make sense. Right. But they're easy conclusions to reach. If you never see a good Black hockey player, then you can presume that Black people can't play hockey. Forget about the fact that they grew up in Harlem. They didn't have a hockey rink anywhere in Harlem. And oh, by the way, it's really expensive to buy all that equipment and get hockey ice time, right? Nobody gets there. They just make a quick solution. But if people get educated, I believe, and I think that's why a lot of these young people are so engaged right now, is because they're learning things. They know more about the Equal Justice Institute than we did. They know about the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Not all of them, but enough of them to start inspiring the change. So if somebody wanted to do something tonight, write your Board of Ed person and ask them to expedite the execution of the Black History curriculum. If you don't know, there's a law in Connecticut. It was passed maybe 2 years ago that now it is mandatory to teach Black history. The dilemma with the law is it gives a lot of flexibility on exactly how you do it. Now, I'm trying to engage, and many people are trying to engage to make sure it's robust. And this is West Hartford. I have high confidence that our school system will do something robust. But the speed at which they execute it can be improved if people engage with their Board of Ed members. I got to tell you, if you don't like history, learning this stuff will be an interesting course. If you want your kids, or maybe we're all too old to have kids that are still in the West Hartford public school system, but if you want someone's kids to have an engaging experience in high school and middle school, I think that would be a very, very good way for them to engage on history and social studies.
We're also, the changes that we're looking at, there's the policy, there's the protests, there's all of the high level changes. But really, we're also having to seek the change of heart, because this is a discrimination at the level of the individual, right? And then, so I think individuals have to look within themselves for both conscious and subconscious traces of prejudice, right? And it's hard to know what is there that's subconscious, but look at your behaviors, examine yourself, and tap into a community that could support you in actually looking at how you behave. I think we also need, just sort of my understanding of where we're sitting in West Hartford, we need to build structures within community, maybe at the level of neighborhood, where people can come together of different colors, of different faiths, of different backgrounds, to really have spaces to grow together. I've been to a couple of churches in the time I've lived here, and some of the questions, it's occurred to me as I walk in, how could this be happening at this time, right? Because these are very segregated spaces. So our children are not going to have any chance of being prejudice-free if they're living in these segregated spaces as they're asking themselves about who they are and what they wish to be, right? Because that's the space where we shape who we want to be. We need to think about, I think our dynamics very much are ones of coexisting. Our schools look diverse as we look at, sort of as you look at the broad picture. But when you look at, what's happening in the classroom and which kids are doing which classes, maybe ways of integrating that more and listening to one another more. But really, in terms of building new structures of society that will help us navigate what lies ahead. And I'm saying this with a lot of hope, because I think in West Hartford, we have the opportunity to get this right. If we ask the right questions and we work together to build maybe neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood, spaces where people are coming together, putting aside differences and figuring it out, right? Because really change, we know as a worldwide experience, happens most effectively at the grassroots level, right? So we then need to come and look at one another and say, well, what's grassroots here? Maybe it's from this street down to the other street, let's build a community where people are coming together and talking and interacting. And looking at questions of who we are, how do we find ourselves, how do we think about other people, right? There are people for whom I'm sure they don't have people who don't look like them come into their homes. What are the lessons there for their children, right? If you speak to any man now, decent man, and say, how did you learn not to catcall? And how did you learn not to abuse women, right? They're going to have some story in terms of, okay, I learned this from my grandfather, or this was what was talked about in our house. So we really owe it to our future generation to do everything that we can to make sure that they are not handicapped in terms of living in a diverse, rich world. So the actions that we take, I think, is at the community level, at the neighborhood level within West Hartford, are really going to set the stage for how they think about one another.
All right, we lost Earl. Hopefully we will get him back on. And if Earl can still hear us, disconnect and then reconnect. I had a question ready for him, and he's gone. So we're gonna sit tight just for a second here and see if we can get Earl back. Anyway, Kenzo, I really appreciate everything you're bringing to the conversation. It's so overwhelming. And I wonder, really, I'll start to lead into my question I had for Earl now is, how do we fix this without having another war? There are such large parts of the country that are just not willing to accept any of the data that Earl's provided, any of the suggestion that you guys have provided. They're just not willing to accept it as reality because they don't want to. I mean, is this going to come down to another war where cities are occupied, where terrible things are happening? And we've got Earl back. So give me 1 second, okay? I'm going to bring him back. Yeah, I do see you, Earl. I am sorry we lost you. I'm asking a question, and I'm going to leave it this way just for continuity. But Earl, I feel there are such large parts of the country that are just not willing to accept the data that you've been so articulate in, and so fact driven in providing, not willing to take the suggestions that both of you and countless others across the country, they don't want to. They're so locked in their ways. I mean, is it going to take another war? Is it going to take another civil war? Could we be facing a situation where cities are occupied, where terrible things are happening as this reckoning continues?
I certainly don't think so. I would think, my personal opinion is, assuming things don't get worse than they are today, it didn't take a civil war to get the civil rights. From the civil rights movement, there was progress that was made.
Right.
Voter. We have better voter laws, though. That people are still trying to keep people from voting. Voter suppression is still real. There's also, there's civil rights legislation that was passed. There's progress that's been made. The civil rights movement made a significant difference, not just in the welfare of Black people, but in our overall society, our overall mentality. Here's an interesting thing to note. Before Martin Luther King was assassinated, he had a 64%, don't quote me on 64, it's that order of magnitude, 64 is what's in my mind, disapproval rating, okay? And after his assassination, the country really thought differently, and Lyndon Johnson and other people who really used, it was sort of the George Floyd incident, leveraged that and said, we got to get this legislation passed. Quite frankly, I think that if we can get leaders in place that put infrastructure in place, quite frankly, it's potentially moving in the other direction. Judges, for example, the number of conservative judges that get appointed, assuming that they're conservative on the issue of race, if it's fiscal conservatism, I can live with that for sure. But if it's in the issue of race, that's locking in systems, right? But we got to get educated people. I make a presumption, and I know it's not fact. There are a lot of educated racists, but I'm going to assume that once you become educated, it's almost like people who grew up being spanked, and they get educated and say, you know what? Do you realize the data shows that spanking your kids doesn't work, right? That you're more likely to traumatize them than you are to make them a productive citizen. Educated people say, you know what? I think I'm going to try not spanking my kids. And at least as far as I can tell, in West Hartford, there's not a whole lot of kids getting spanked. But the point is, once you get that education and then you start living your life and executing with your vote, with your appointments, with people you select to join your company, with people you help promote, the progress gets made. I don't think it's a war. I think it's, if this could be like a second civil rights movement, I think we can make significant progress. And honestly, we have allowed the education institution that we have to exist since the early 1900s with very little change. Just one other point. One of the reasons why it doesn't change is because Texas cares more about what's in the curriculum than just about any other state. And the most textbooks are sold, or a huge number of textbooks are sold in Texas, so they have a disproportionate influence over our curriculum. That's got to stop. We got to teach people what we know is right. And I think that makes a lot of difference in the world. And again, I'm encouraged that we're even having this conversation. I certainly don't think it takes another war. Might take another movement, but I don't think it takes another war.
Earl, there's a spot on the West Hartford Board of Ed open. I'd like to officially nominate you. All those in favor.
I can't vote.
We're actually over time here, and I have so many questions that I haven't even asked yet. I'm happy to go a few more minutes if you guys want to, or we can wrap it up. I know people have other matters and other things.
We might be up against the WHCI
I think
schedule.
I think we're off WHCI at this point, but it is being recorded, so it is something that could air later. So why don't we do this? I think, Ronni, I think we need to continue this dialogue in general, and Earl and Kedzo. I can't tell you guys how much I've learned and how little I know in the last hour.
I echo everything you just said, John. Yeah.
So, why don't we wrap it up? And, I'd like to do this again, and I really hope we can have you both back, because this is really important stuff. And to all of I think all three of you made the point, we can't let the conversation quiet down. It's up to us to keep the conversation going and keep it front and center of people's minds. So, any last comments from anybody? And Ronni, any questions? We're doing a little differently, so I'm not sure if we're getting.
Yeah, I don't see that any questions. I've checked Facebook a couple of times. I don't see that there have been any questions posed. I've had a few comments by text, but not anything that I'd necessarily read out loud. I mean, they're just kind of people agreeing with everything that's been discussed here.
Earl, any last comments before we sign off?
The only thing I'll tell you is that there is a Juneteenth celebration in West Hartford tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. I think it's at Goodwin Green. So if people want to attend that, I think it's another opportunity to educate. Because the funny thing is, I don't think it was Donald Trump's intention to make the whole country aware of Juneteenth when he scheduled this rally. But given the timing and the circumstance, it's another opportunity to get educated about a significant event in our history. The last thing I will say is, we spent a lot of time talking about, history in the United States. That's roughly 400 years of history. If you look at Black history, it goes back at least 2.5 million years. Why 2.5? Because that's when we started discovering tools, things that only humans would make. And then it's fast forward for there that the greatest societies, and I've said it before, everything from libraries, universities, agriculture, irrigation, writing, mathematics. And I don't just mean mathematics. The Pythagorean theorem and the quadratic equation were done in Africa and the Middle East like 500 years before Christ. I mean, and before the 1400s, the people like in Greece, like Homer, looked at Africa as the place of highest learning. The oldest university in the world continuous university in the world is in Morocco, in Africa. I think we focus in on the 400 years of subjugation. Every culture gets their chance to be belittled because it serves someone else's purpose, but it's only in the grand scheme of things, it's 400 years. So, I think people get their head around, wow, why aren't Black people doing well? Black people were doing extremely well for most of our history. This is just a unfortunate period.
When I was writing the introduction for the show yesterday, I was on with Kedzo. We were doing a little bit of a test to make sure everything was working, and Kedzo used the term modern racism, and really spanning a 401 year period, which is really horrifying when you put those two words in one construct. It's really pretty upsetting. So, but I thought it was really apt, which is why I used it in the title. So, Earl, what's the name? Give us the name and the author of that book again, please.
Which book?
The New Jim Crow.
The Jim Crow.
The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I will tell you, it's a lot of data. It's a lot of facts. It's not like a fiction book. It's like a history book for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's so enlightening, but at times disturbing. I had to put it down twice before I could finish it because it's a tough read, but it's all data. It's not someone's opinion. It's data.
Sure.
Put it on. Sorry. Any last words from you?
Sure. You ask, are we looking at another war, really? And, what's quite wonderful, I think, and an opportunity is that the answer to that question lies in our hands. That we each as individuals need to seek within ourselves all the barriers to oneness, and the things that keep us apart from one another. And then we also need to sort of build these bridges, extend friendship, and get to know one another, and to reach out to people who don't look like us, sort of bring into our circle, our intimate circle, those who are downtrodden, because that's the way that we create robust communities that then can say, no, we don't want to do that because we are figuring it out here as individuals. So, neighbor to neighbor, street to street, individual to individual, we can put in place a new kind of society and start to actually think about the structures that we could put in that aren't based on bias, racial bias and discrimination, but building from that ground up is really the antidote to what you were talking about. So I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to share and to learn so much, but really think that the individual change and the community change is where we need to be looking.
Kadzo Kangwana, sorry about that. I got it right, and then I finally tripped over. Earl Exum, thank you both so much for being on. We really appreciate it. For Ronni Newton and WHAASCO.com, I'm John Lyons, and we will see you next week.